Hello everybody, today's video is something a little bit different, and it's a little bit different not necessarily by design. Today we're doing a little bit of a retrospective and we're looking back at the recently discontinued BMW M4 and its M3 sibling. Now, eagle-eyed viewers might be able to spot the fact that I am not currently driving an M4. I was supposed to be driving an M4 for this video, and I even came all the way out to meet an owner of said car and review it. And he didn't turn up. This is actually the first time that this has happened in my YouTube career, and it is a little bit irksome, but I am not one to be defeated, and you are still going to get your content. Fortunately, I have a large back catalogue of M3 and M4 content to draw upon alongside the BMW UK's media library, so there'll be plenty of M3 and M4 pictures for those who want to watch the video, and for those who just want to listen, well, I was going to be talking in a car one way or the other. Now, the BMW M3 is an interesting car because it is an icon, but it's also been quite an amorphous thing in its time. There are certain vehicles out there that adhere to a fundamental recipe, and if you were to change that, well, all hell would simply break loose. For example, can you imagine what would happen if Porsche suddenly said, you know what, the next 911 is actually going to have an Audi 5-cylinder in it? People would go nuts. However, the M4 has been, well, pretty varied in its lineup. The original E30 was powered by a 4-cylinder high-revving NA engine. Then the subsequent generations had that glorious BMW straight-six M motor. The E90 generation of car had that absolutely stunning and my personal favourite V8 in it. And then the big announcement. The M3 was going to be, in some ways, no more. BMW decided to split the 3 Series lineup so that the 3 Series Coupe no longer existed, instead becoming the 4 Series. And that meant, of course, that you are now going to have an M4, which actually came out, I believe, just before the 3. The big change, of course, aside from that of the name, was in the engine department. Out went the glorious S65 V8 and in went the S55 straight-six twin-turbo, a development of the N Series engine. This was a radical departure for BMW, who previously had been strict adherents to the high-revving, naturally aspirated school of thought. I very nearly bought an M4 when they came out, and there's a few reasons that I didn't. At the time, I was in a market for a car that was, well, special, and the M4 just never really felt that to me. I also could see that they were going to lose an awful lot of money, and in fact the car that I went to drive, which was an AC Schnitzer kitted vehicle, looked absolutely stunning, by the way. That lost £15,000, sat on the forecourt of the dealer who had it before it eventually went, so I think I was sensible to not go in for that one. The big problems I had with the M4 were twofold. First off, it's very big, but more than that, it's very difficult to see out of because the bonnet line is so high and you sit reasonably low. You can't place the car all that well. There's huge swathes of it that are just, well, they're over there somewhere. And for the kind of roads I drive on, it's just not very helpful. The other issue was that engine. Now, on paper, it had only a few extra ponies over the outgoing V8, but the big difference was in torque, with something like another third more torquey than the old V8 at about a third the RPM. And the problem that I had was that this car simply wanted to kill you at every available opportunity. I test drove the M4 on a day which was actually not entirely unlike today. It wasn't particularly warm. There was a little bit of damp on the roads. And I was driving in a straight line and I changed gear. This is a DCT equipped car. I changed gear and the whole back end just broke loose. The thing wanted to kill me, driving in a straight line. It also seemed to be extraordinarily thirsty, and the whole thing just, well, I just simply didn't gel with it. But, and I am willing to accept this, my opinion on a vehicle isn't always the most important thing. There are a lot of other criteria that are more significant to a lot of people out there. And you certainly can't say that the M3 and M4 haven't sold well. BMW certainly brought a raft of improvements as the model lineup went along, and a few different variants too. You had the competition pack, and basically the moment that came out, that seemed to be the only one that anyone bought. You also had the ridiculously overpriced GTS, which I think tried to recapture some of the magic of the E92 GTS and failed spectacularly. And then late in the model's life, you also had the CS, which similarly was a total disaster from a financial perspective. A friend of mine picked up an M3 CS, but this one. And it's a lovely car, but it should have been just over £90,000 according to BMW. He picked it up for about 60, and you can now get them for even less. So that car lost something like 30% of its value before it was even sold for the first time. That should tell you, if nothing else, that BMW got things rather wrong. The M4, towards the end of its life, had a very simple problem, and that was the M4. Lots of them sold, and when lots of these things sell, that means there are, of course, plenty of them on the market. And the moment the first leases get done with, so 2 to 3 years into the model's life cycle, the market starts getting flooded with people that are getting out of them, and that means people can then buy them at considerable discounts. This means that BMW, if they want to sell a new one, have to start knocking the price down or giving out incentives, and then the whole cycle kind of repeats. At the present time, 30 grand will quite happily get you into an M3 or an M4, and to be honest, I can easily see a scenario in the not too distant future where just over 20 grand will get you in a half decent example. I'm sure 20 to 25 grand might get you in one now, but it probably wouldn't be the kind of car that you'd actually want to own. So the title of today's video is, how will history remember the M4? Well, I think it really is going to go down in history as one of the most important models that BMW ever brought out. There's a very simple reason for that. I personally believe that the M4 is really the closest Germany might ever come to producing something akin to the iconic Japanese tuner classics of the 1990s. As far as I'm concerned, the M4 is a relatively unremarkable car. I don't think it really drove that brilliantly. It doesn't talk to me, it doesn't engage with you as a driver, but you cannot deny that it is outrageously fast. That increased torque figure meant that out of the box, those things were savage, where the old V8 car, well, most of them never quite felt as fast as their numbers would suggest. That's possibly down to the fact that even a reasonably healthy E92 M3 probably doesn't make its claimed power figures, at least not until someone's breathed on it properly. Even in the early days, you just needed to breathe on these things and you could get a good 500 horsepower out of them, up from the 425 of the standard car. And it didn't take all that long before people realised that they were good for a hell of a lot more. I know that Ricky over at Living Life Fast is currently running over 700 brake on his pure turbos car, and I think if you don't want to do any major mods, they're generally good up to about 600 horsepower. Okay, you're not going to have the all-wheel drive ability of something like a Nissan GT-R, but the M4 is generally a much newer car, a nicer place to be, and can be cheaper to run. Personally, out of the two, I'd actually have the GT-R because I think it's the more interesting, more exciting car to drive, and although I really didn't like that when it came out, they have really grown on me, especially in the looks department. Other things I didn't like about the M4, and I think will never be solved, include the horrendous noise out the back of them. The way they set up those cars, it's almost run like 2 3-cylinder engines, so the standard exhaust, I don't believe, ever actually meets. It's just 2 3-pods, and it sounds nasty. That's in stark comparison to the B58, the more modern engine, which is going to be the basis for the new M lump, which actually sounds very tasty indeed. It's a very nice engine, that. It's very torquey, and if the new M motor is anything like that, and it must be because it's based on it, well, expect the torque out of the new car to be perhaps even crazier than the old one. Trying to ascertain the reason for the M3's evergreen appeal is actually fairly easy. They are basically all things to all people. And one of the reasons that people continually bang on about the E46 M3, even though I am of the belief it is possibly one of the most overrated cars there has ever been, it's a cheap car to buy and you can do basically what you want with it. If you want to make it a drift car, you can. If you want to make it a track car, you can. If you want to enjoy it and treat it like a near classic, you can. You can buy them at relatively cheap prices, and you can try and fool yourself into thinking that they're going to be cheap to run, even though, believe me, they often are not. Yes, I was burned by mine, but then so were many other people I know burned by theirs. The people I know that have owned M4s haven't always had the best luck with them, and they have seemed to be not the most reliable M car ever made. Now, part of that I think is due to the fact that these were putting so much more power and torque through their drivetrains than ever before, but the big ticket items like engine and gearbox seem to be quite durable. It's more things like differentials and suspension components that seem to suffer in the cars I've known to fail. Other small items too, like trim on the inside, but of course the great thing about parts failing is that an aftermarket appears, and the M4 within the first few years had an extremely healthy market of various parts from all around the world. So whether you're in Europe, Japan, the USA, you're going to be able to find something for your car. The M4 also is perhaps gaining a reputation as being the hooligan's car of choice. After all, if you want to do mad skids, brah, it's possibly one of the easiest and cheapest ways to do that. The fact is that so many of these classic Japanese cars have become such silly money that the M4 actually nearly looks like good value, because 1990s Japanese cars can often cost even more than a nearly new M. It looked for a little while like the current generation M4 could have gone down in history as the last pure driver's M car, with rear-wheel drive, a manual gearbox option and all that jazz, but I think the next M3 is going to also have both 4- and 2-wheel drive, and might even come in a 2-wheel drive manual version, possibly called the Pure. Now, I might be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure somebody at BMW has looked at what happened over at Porsche when they did a stripped out bare manual car with the 911R and gone, that could be a good idea. Same as with the GT3 Touring. Not everybody wants all the bells, whistles and fripperies on their car. Whatever the case may be, you can't deny the fact that there are lots of M4s out there. They're pretty cheap to get into. They are, for the performance on offer, fairly cheap to run. You can make them loud, you can make them even sillier, even quicker than standard. You can do that any number of different ways. And they're kind of good looking cars as well. Not my favourite thing, of course, but you've got manual, you've got DCT, you've got rear-wheel drive. If you're a hooligan, and there are lots of those people out there, it is the perfect car. And so with prices of the E46 and potentially soon the E92 maybe on the rise, I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 5 to 10 years you see the M4 actually being cheaper than something like a nice E46, because, well, that is just going to happen. People probably won't believe me, and I totally accept that, but just look at history. The E46s, the good ones, are vanishing fast because they're just not being looked after, or they haven't been looked after for a long time, and all of a sudden people are going to wake up and go, hang on a minute, where did they go? And then everyone will realise that they should be asking a lot more money for them than they really are. And then everyone will go, well, you know, what can we actually get in instead? Let's go get the M4. And you can also drive it into the middle of London and stuff like that. And those are things that are going to make the older cars harder to own and run and all that jazz. And so the M4 is going to stay around for quite a while. But that's my theory anyway. You tell me what you think. I'd love to hear your opinion on it. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.